So I'm Husheng Livian. I'm head of design for Hortonworks.
I'm George Betikata, and I run product for Hortonworks Emerging Products HDF.
So what we're going to do today is walk through the case study of how we came up with the Streams Messaging Manager and how we kind of came to the realization that there's this Kafka blindness that goes on in the industry. But first I wanted to kind of just talk about our mindset on this, just as a point of reference. So in general, how a developer sees a product, they see it as databases, screens, API layers, and algorithms. There are all these things that kind of come together as one thing. There's hundreds of things, hundreds of details of what a product means to a developer. On the other side, how a user sees a product is just one thing, one goal, one thing that they're trying to get across. So there's hundreds of details. Imagine there's a 1,000 possible designs between these two spectrums, between what the user's thinking and what the developer thinks. So let's say only 20% of those are good, as an example. And maybe only 3% of those are really delightful, which takes a lot of time to do, to really come up with a delightful design. Now, who decides when a design is good? Anybody? Right. So it's the user that decides, right? That's how you know whether you're matching what the user is doing. So this is what we're going to walk through is essentially the process, the mindset that we had when we walked through, when we went through the steps to create this. So I want to talk about something called a double diamond design process, which essentially starts as there's 4 phases to it, and each phase is one piece of a diamond. Now the first piece here, the research piece, is about going broad. It's divergent thinking. It's thinking about going really wild in terms of ideas, of trying to figure things out, competitive research, that kind of thing. And then we kind of hone in the research to come to conclusions, come to an analysis, which is the second side of this diamond. Now, the second diamond begins with design. Now, this is where we're just going crazy. We're coming up with a lot of ideas. Again, we're divergent thinking. And then we validate that design. Does that make sense to everybody? So we're going to walk through this so you can kind of ignore this slide. But this is essentially the process that we went through, the 15 steps to kind of come to the design of the Streams Messaging Manager.
All right, so I'm going to take a little bit of time. So as part of the product team at Hortonworks and, living in this world of open source and building enterprise products that we give to customers built on these open source products, building product is very different in a company like Hortonworks than a typical enterprise organization. So I want to give you a little bit of insight of how that's done, how the sausage is made, right? So, when we finished a given release, so as an owner of HDF, which includes things like Apache NiFi, Storm, Spark Streaming, Kafka, and those kind of things, at the end of the release, we say, okay, right, what are the next set of key features that we want to build out and tooling and so forth for the next release? And so the typical first step is I've got a backlog of items that I get talking to customers, backlog in Jira and those kind of things. And what I did is using things like Trello dashboard, or any of these tools where you can essentially do collaboration, I put kind of the key areas of interest based on customer feedback where we need to continue to invest, right? So things around maybe integration with Atlas, or things like schema registry, tooling around Kafka Manager, right? But something to spark a conversation. So the screenshot that you see here is kind of this dashboard view, right? And then what we do is we say, okay, we bring in various teams within the organization. So we bring in the support team. Hortonworks, their business model is selling support, right? So the folks who are actually on the support team, our support engineers, really understand what customers need, what their pain points are, and those kind of things. So we bring in the support team and say, hey, you've got 3 hearts and 3 check marks, right? So a heart represents something you would like to see in the next release, and a check mark represents what you feel like the customers that you talk to day in and out are important to them, right? And you said you've got essentially 3 check marks, 3 hearts. Go to town, go through the list, and you know, put your heart or your check mark there, right? And after that, we say, okay, you have to explain why you put that check mark or heart there, right? And it's really fascinating because that really then that gives us a corpus of data for us to work with, right? And that whole process, we do that with various groups. So after the support team goes out, we bring in the engineering team, because engineering team for production issues, they work with it, they talk to customers all the time. That's the second group. We bring in solutions engineers that talk to it, and then we bring in the community. We talk to contributors in terms of, for example, with things like Kafka and so forth, right? And we go through this process where it's not just internal Hortonworks, but also leveraging the community and understanding, hey, what are the needs that you would like to see, right? So that's like the first step. The next step is kind of then distilling that out, right? And this is traditional of and this is not unique to a Hortonworks or an open source company like us, but we then flesh out those with the most amount of check marks and hearts, right? We do estimates from an engineering perspective. We also have to take into account what the community might help us with and those kind of things. So there's another dimension to that where we figure out, yeah, how does the community help us drive in addition to all the stuff that we're going to do in terms of the committers and contributors that we have at Hortonworks, right? So we kind of flesh that out. And what was clear as part of that last release is that the need for Kafka and the tooling around Kafka was incredibly, incredibly important, right? And that stuck, and it was so obvious from that analysis. And so it's okay. So as part of that next release, we got to build something in terms of this notion of building better tooling around Kafka. But we still didn't know what exactly that meant, right? And so what we did is then we went through the next step was where we try to collect and detail the requirements, right? And again, working for an open source company like Hortonworks, you've got access to committers and contributors around Kafka. You've got folks in the field like professional services that are building real world use cases and those kind of things. You've got solutions engineers that work day in and day out implementing use cases, understanding what their use case requirements are and so forth. And we started to then flesh out what specifically Kafka management meant, right? And so we did that with respect to field and customers. So Hortonworks, we're blessed to have quite a bit of customers, given that over the last 5 or 6 years, and we've got hundreds of customers that use Kafka today that they pay us for support, right? So asking specifically, what are some of the specific needs that you have with respect to Kafka? And so we collect all this data. From a competitive perspective, we look at the market and understand, hey, we have customers that are downloading Yahoo Kafka Manager open source tooling, right? We have customers that go to Heroku as a service to get Kafka management. So understanding from a market perspective what competitors and so forth are doing, understanding, going to the Apache threads and understanding, hey, from an Apache perspective, you see all the time new open source tooling around Kafka and so forth. And so we accumulate all of this data, and we can then start to flesh out kind of detail level requirements and so forth, right? And again, it's collecting, and again, as Hortonworks, being a big data company, we do a decent job of trying to leverage as much of those data points as again in terms of making decisions about building the right product. So what's interesting that one insight that we learned from this process is that you go create a 20-page Google Doc document or a 40-page Google Doc document of requirements, no one in their right mind is going to read it, right? And so you need something to socialize, right? And so what we do is at Hortonworks, we try to distill that down into a product definition deck that you socialize, right? You socialize with the engineering team. You socialize with the professional services team. You socialize with customers, right? During this period, we talked to a bunch of customers. Instead of giving this 40-page requirements, we say, hey, this is the information we've collected. Vet it out. Is it accurate? And those kind of things. And that becomes important as part of continuing to make sure we're on the right track. This, tied back to RMPs, that's the process using Jira and so forth. And then we've got, at this point, something very important. And typically, people stop here, right? It's like, okay, we've got these requirements. We've kind of vetted it out, right? And they typically stop there, right? So one of the things that we've learned, because we've learned the hard way, right? I think all of you can admit that Hadoop at some point was very hard to use and the tooling around it, right? And so over the last couple of years, Hortonworks has transformed themselves into focusing on consumability, ease of use, and so forth. And so what we do at this point is we talk to 6 different groups, right? And we have the requirements, what we want to understand from a day in and day out perspective. How do people work with Kafka, right? If I'm in a large enterprise company, I have a platform operations team and their responsibility for day in and managing Kafka, right? What does their day look like? When they come in, what do they want to see, right? What are some of the existing tool sets that they look, right? What is, from a step-by-step perspective, what are the steps what they diagnose where you've got a slow consumer, right? Or identifying why my consumer doesn't have all the data on those kind of things, right? And so we try to then talk to expertise, subject matter experts within Hortonworks, but also our customers and within our community, right? And as part of the next set of steps, Husheng is going to kind of walk through kind of what that process looks like.
So I want to make sure that I reconnect this back to that double diamond that I showed earlier in the presentation. This is us kind of, we're still in that first phase of research, right? It's all this competitive work, all this research we're doing with the field, with our customers, and kind of understanding. But now we're going to go focus specifically on the design, which is, the design is the interaction design, the visual design, the motion design, making sure that we're really matching the way the mental model of the person is. Remember those first slides I was talking about, that kind of, we have this really complex idea of products and people just have this like one thing that they want to do. So what is that one thing? How do we simplify this down to an essentials so that this is really is a design that knocks it out of the park? So first thing we do is we need to gather all of our thoughts. So we sit down and we create this discussion guide. This is the actual like board with all the different questions that we had, and then we put it together into a guide so that George and I can just sit there and read from the script, or go off the cuff as we're talking to customers. So here's an example of some of the conversations we're having.
I see one of them right here.
Right, it's right there. I was going to point him out. So everyone else is kind of blurred out. But and then you can see George kind of stole my question, so that's why I'm looking at him like that. Anyway, so we interview users, we gather all this research, and then here's where we're kind of moving to the second phase, which is the analysis, the synthesis of that research. It included this kind of like really collecting the data and analyzing it in several different ways. This is one, it's called an affinity mapping exercise, where we're kind of like just gathering these thoughts together. We also kind of collected it on the board and really just spent a long time talking about these different thoughts and different things that were kind of coming up. And this is where the idea of Kafka blindness really kind of came to the surface, right? There's this idea that people just don't know what's happening inside of Kafka. That's the problem. It's a wonderfully, amazingly architected system. It's mind-blowingly brilliant, and yet you just don't know what's going on inside of it. And it's like nobody noticed that. So we noticed that was like a really key thing that we can focus on. The other thing was we noticed that it's really hard to train somebody how Kafka works so that you can operationalize it, right? So you can have somebody else kind of manage it, right? There's too much complexity for you to teach somebody about it. So we really strove to cure that Kafka blindness and make it easy to teach to other people. So then we kind of go into a phase of where we're stepping into the second diamond, the design phase, right? We're going into design. We're really getting into understanding all these different ways that we can handle it, and we're exchanging ideas back and forth. And this is everybody on the team. It's PM, it's design, it's engineering. Documentation. We're all just kind of gathering our thoughts together of how this might look. And there's several different modes of exercises that we're doing. This is the whiteboard exercise where we're kind of like trying to understand what should be on that first page. So these next, like steps 12 through 15 are all design concepts. So initially what I came up with is 5 different ways that this could function, this kind of landing page could look. And again, we're trying to do those 2 things, cure the blindness and teach, right? Be easy to teach to somebody. So we first thought to use a Sankey diagram was one of the designs, and this was a strong contender for what we ended up doing. This was not a strong contender, but it was interesting. Like, we're looking at these really important metrics, lag and consumer offset rate, and lag rate and producer offset rate, kind of the key, what we surfaced from our research are the really key metrics to understanding what's going on and knowing whether there's an issue I need to address. And then here's probably the worst of the designs, but anyway, hard to understand. And then, we had this kind of circular design. It's pretty cool, with a lot of information on the sides explaining what's going on.
I think this in particular was interesting because when you first look at it, like, there's the sexiness of it, and it's like, awesome, that's so cool, yeah. And then we get it in front of customers, and they're like, I have no idea what I'm looking at. Yeah. Right? And those kind of things. And I think as a PM, you kind of say, oh, wow, that looks great. That's great for demos and that kind of stuff. But then from a realistic day in and day out, can you see a platform operation person looking at this for 8 hours a day and trying to make sense of it, right? And there's that trade-off between practicality versus the sexiness of it and those kind of things. That's why feedback is so important, I think.
Yeah. So the fifth of the concepts is what I wanted to kind of stop at, because this is what led to the design that we actually have. You have like the producers sitting on one side, the consumers on the other, and then you have in here the brokers with the topics that are inside of them. We ended up kind of really pushing on this idea quite a bit, so I'll kind of show you some of the steps in between. So here we added like ability to kind of have these filters that are across the top, and the design starts to get a little crazy with my huge buttons up there. You have to forgive me for those. But still the same kind of concept of producers with brokers and topics in the middle and consumers on the other side. So this is where we as a team came to a conclusion, like, this is good. Like, we're ready to go and talk to customers. So we went back and interviewed several customers to kind of get an idea of their reaction to it. And the way we structured the interviews was interesting because we didn't tell them anything about the design. We just asked them to tell us about the design. So it's a kind of an effective way for you to get a good first reaction to somebody. Ask them to explain us what this is and what it does. So a couple things that came out were that there's a timeline slider up here at the top. Like, people didn't get that. We had to explain what it was. It wasn't just inductive. And what were some of the other things that came up? Oh, yeah, that brokers it seems logical they would be first, but actually people are only concerned about topics. They only want to look at brokers if there's an issue. So we finalized on this design, which is we simplified the kind of time selection piece. We just focused on topics. And then if you go into a topic, you can see the partitions, and you can see the replicas. You can see kind of everything that you need to know. And so what's key about this is that it cures that Kafka blindness. You can see from one end to another what's happening. And it's also easy to educate somebody on how this works, because this is the same diagram that people use to teach people, right? This is how you teach people how Kafka works. You say, you have one piece on this, and it does it for everything you want to click on. You can easily instruct people on how Kafka works, and you can also see the full life cycle of data as it moves through.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in one interview, someone actually said, I have to go execute a bunch of shell scripts and then draw on paper how data flows from producer to the topics to the consumers, right? And that's gold for us, because to me, that's a good thing to add to the product. And so ideas like this, where you actually see the lines and the flow of data across those three key entities, is really valuable. And that's where some of those insights came from. Yeah.
That's not the end, but we lost. This is awesome.
While we're doing this, maybe, okay.
There we go.
I think this room is haunted.
It's a haunted room. So we wanted to show a demo today, but it doesn't look like we're going to be able to do that.
So good news is that demo, so who's going to the demo Lollapalooza thing? at 5:45. So this is actually one of the key demos there, right? We wanted to kind of give you guys a sneak peek because of this haunted room, we can't get stuff projected on here. But you won't miss anything. And I think you guys will have more insight when you guys look through that stuff in terms of how we came into some of those designs. I'll share some other details. If we go back to the previous screen. One of the key things that stood out that if we had not done these deep dive interviews about user interaction is just this concept of the 4 entities people always think about when they think about troubleshooting Kafka, right? And that's those 4 entities that you see on the top, right? And this notion of producers sending data to topics and brokers and consumers, right? And having to see that visually from left to right, right? And being able to filter always across those 4 entities, right? That was, that was a common factor in every interview that we did across small customers, large customers, and those kind of things, right? And so some of the things that you'll see in the demo later today at the Demo Lollapalooza is having those intelligent filtering. So if I'm a DevOps guy, right, and I'm only interested in seeing entities associated with my set of applications, because typically Kafka is multi-tenant. What that means is a platform team is going to be managing Kafka for a number of business units, and those business units they're going to have their own Kafka topics, have their own Kafka producers, and consuming applications. And so if I'm a DevOps guy for that application, I want to come in here, and I only want to see entities associated with my applications, all right? And so I want to be able to say, okay, I want to filter on these topics, but when I filter on these topics, I want the system to intelligently filter out the producers and the consumers that are associated with those topics, yep. Right? So that relationships within those 4 key entities, those are all like the gold nuggets that you get. And being as part of the community, there's a larger set of folks that you can talk to and get data from. And I think that's the part of the community that people don't talk about, where you can essentially engage them to get, not only enhance the development efforts, but also to collect the data points to build right products and so forth. Yeah.
So the last thing that I wanted to touch on before we open it up for questions is just to kind of wrap up this concept of the double diamond design process. If any of you are going to be making products in the future, I think this is it's a really simple idea. If you want to make products that people love, you just need to talk to them. I know that sounds simple and crazy, but it's all it is. It's something that we've been ignoring in the development industry, the R&D industry for so many years. Yet it's so essential just to simply go out and talk to a customer and understand who they are, what they're doing, and what the world is that they live in. And that way you can build products that really fit their needs, essentially. And I think that there's been a lot of Kafka products that have come across the market. There's a lot of open source tools. I hear about new tools every single day. And nobody's really noticed that there's this Kafka blindness issue. And if they did, I think that, and it just comes from talking to people. All you need to do is just go talk to people who are actually trying to run this. To really get these insights. So if you're building products in the future, anyone in this room, I'd charge you with, go to talk to people before you build it.
not after it. And as you're building it as well, right?
And as you're
one of the things is, as engineering is pulled out, working in an agile environment, right, you get frequent builds and so forth. Because at that point, you want to be agile enough to adapt, right? So we put this in front of customers, in front of the community, various members of the community say, hey, this is with the latest incarnation. Any thoughts, any ideas? I'll give you a recent example, right? So, we had the producers on the left-hand side and consumers on the right-hand side, right? And so if you think about a large organization where you're going to have hundreds of thousands of producers and consumers, right? They're constantly connected, disconnected, and so forth. What people started saying is, I want the ability to see active producers. What that means is producers are actually sending me data right now. And then inactive producers are producers that are connected, but for some reason they've stopped sending me data, right? It's those nuances and so forth that makes that product delightful. And that's why we added this active and inactive, right? That was a function. It wasn't originally part of the initial design, right? It was based on that iterative loop feedback that we got as the product was being built and those kind of things.
Great.
Yep.
All right. Any questions?
Questions. Yep.
Where is this UI
Yeah, so it's going to be outside of Ambari, and so we're going to talk more about it as part of Demo Lollapalooza. So this is going to be actually open sourced within the next 2 months. There's going to be a series of blogs and so forth from Hortonworks perspective. As part of that, it's going to be, from a Hortonworks perspective, it's going to be part of data plane, right, as a data plane service and those kind of things. But again, everything we do is open source, so you'll see this open sourced within the next 8 weeks or so forth. So it's pretty exciting. Yes. I'm sorry?
Can you change or alter settings within the topic?
Yeah.
Bunch messages or create or delete topics?
Yeah, good question, right? So this is topic management, right? So everything we showed you right now was a focus on monitoring and metrics and so forth. And that was, so one of the things from these data points that we realized is, as a company, you have to prioritize. Right? And so the prioritization was initially we're like, yeah, topic management. Right now you still have to use the stuff in the bin directory and the shell scripts to create topics and those kind of stuff. So, but then if you ask customers, hey, what do you want to see as the first MVP of this product? Right? Do you want the topic management stuff where you can update and delete and create and have this partition calculator to help you figure out what the partitions are and those kind of things? Or do you really want, okay, that's a pain in the ass to do, but what I really want is the monitoring aspect. Overwhelmingly, the response was focus on the monitoring as the MVP. So to your question, that's not as part of the MVP. You'll see that in subsequent phases. Yeah.
When is the subsequent next release? I think it's...
Yeah, so and again, iteratively, so I would say, towards the fall time frame, you'll see subsequent, like some of these changes in, yeah. Yes. Yes. I don't know if you've got the.
I don't have the mock.
That mock. Yeah. So you can go into the detail.
Search button. Yeah.
Yeah. You can go. Yeah. The search gives you a data exploration view. Another great insight that we got back from our users, right? Where they right now, if you guys are Kafka users, you guys are all using the Kafka console shell script where you can essentially write that, execute that command. You see the stuff scrolling down the screen, those kind of things, right? So they said, be really good from a DevOps. I just want to see what's in the topic, right? Obviously, you're not going to be able to show everything, so search by offsets, maybe longer term, use SQL and those kind of things. So yes, data exploration, sampling what's in it, supporting different serializers and those kind of things. So if you're using Avro deserializer or string or some other serializer supporting that, that's all part of the MVP. Yeah. Good question. Other questions? Yep.
So is it just a dashboard or is there any monitoring?
Yeah, so there is, so all of this is backed by REST, right? So as part of the first MVP, there's alerting capabilities as part of actually the REST services. In terms of within the monitoring, being able to create alerts, triggers, thresholds, those are in subsequent releases, yeah. Yes. I'm sorry? Yeah, so when we push this into open source, and again, having been part of other projects like Metron and Schema Registry and Streaming Analytics Manager, when we make it open source, I think publishing the roadmap becomes critical as well, so you'll see that as part of that open source. Again, we want the community active participation in it, so roadmap becomes critical. Yep.
How does it read the information? Does it just read the GMX, or is there something running inside Kafka more complex communication?
Yeah, good question. Quick question. So the question was, where does the data come from in terms of the data that you see here, right? And it's a couple of different stores. So one is JMX, one is that. There's a lot of information about consumer offsets and so forth within the internal Kafka topics, right? So we're leveraging that. Some information is stored within Zookeeper, right? So we're leveraging that information. And then one of the important things that we found as part of this exercise is you want to be able to go back in time, right? So I want to understand what's happening now, but I also want to understand what the broker throughput was, who the producers and consumers was maybe 2 weeks ago or a month, right? And that requires a time series database of some sorts, right? So Ambari has an internal time series database built on top of HBase. So we're actually collecting all of these metrics from GMX, from the internal Kafka topics and so forth, putting it into this time series database. That's the fourth data store that we're accessing as well. Yeah. Good question. Yes?
Security of the dashboard.
Yes. So one thing working with enterprise customers is an MVP is not an MVP if you don't have security, right? So supporting full Kerberized clusters, things like SSO, AD integration, Ranger support, where you get role-based access control in terms of what you can do. All of that is supported as first MVP.
Thank you. That's all the time we have.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, we have shirts.
Wait, we've got 2 or 3 shirts.
Two or three shirts.
whoever.
You gotta be fast.